Walk down the Champs-Élysées today, and you're surrounded by luxury boutiques, sidewalk cafes, and 10 million tourists each year. Cross the Seine on one of Paris's 37 bridges. Stand before the Eiffel Tower. This is the City of Light. 2.1 million people in the city proper, 12 million in the metropolitan area. But rewind exactly 824 years, to the year 1200 AD, and stand on the La de la Cité in the middle of the Seine River, and you'd be in a completely different world. No Eiffel Tower, no grand boulevards, no sidewalk cafes, no bridges to speak of, just two, both wooden and crowded with buildings. Instead, you'd stand on a densely packed island city of perhaps 50,000 people, where raw sewage ran in open ditches down the middle of unpaved streets, where pigs rooted through garbage piles, where the smell of human waste, rotting food, and animal dung was so overwhelming that nobles carried scented handkerchiefs, where a single spark could burn down entire neighborhoods, where bandits operated openly at night, where disease killed without warning. This is how people actually lived in medieval Paris in the year 1200, not in romantic castles and noble courts, but in mud, darkness, and constant danger. The geography of medieval Paris. To understand Paris in 1200, you must first understand its geography, because the city was fundamentally different in size and shape from modern Paris. The heart of Paris was the La de la Cité, the boat-shaped island in the middle of the Seine. This island, approximately 900 meters long and 300 meters wide, contained the royal palace, the Cathedral of Notre-Dame, still under construction in 1200, and the densest concentration of population. King Philip II Augustus ruled France in 1200. He had ascended to the throne in 1180 at age 15, and would rule until 1223. Philip was transforming Paris from a medieval town into something approaching a true capital. His most important contribution was the construction of new city walls. In 1190, before departing for the Third Crusade, Philip ordered the construction of walls around the right bank, the northern side of the Seine, to protect the expanding settlement there. These walls, built of stone, enclosed roughly 250 hectares on the right bank. On the left bank, the southern side, existing walls from earlier periods enclosed the university quarter, but much of what we consider Paris today was outside these walls: open countryside, fields, vineyards, monasteries, and scattered villages. The city proper was compact, contained within defined boundaries. Two bridges connected the La de la Cité to the riverbanks. The Grand Pont Great Bridge connected the island to the right bank. The Petit Pont Small Bridge connected to the left bank. Both were wooden structures built on stone pilings, and both were lined with buildings, shops, houses, even a chapel on the Grand Pont. These bridges were not just crossings but commercial streets suspended over water. Architecture and building materials. The architecture of Paris in 1200 was overwhelmingly timber construction, with stone reserved for the most important buildings. Most houses were 2 or 3 stories tall, built with timber frames and wattle and daub walls. Wattle and daub consisted of vertical wooden stakes with horizontal branches woven between them, the whole structure then covered with a mixture of wet clay, mud, straw, and animal dung, which hardened into a solid wall. Upper floors often projected out over the street, supported by wooden brackets, making the streets even narrower at ground level. Roofs were steeply pitched and covered with thatch bundles of straw or reeds laid in overlapping layers. Thatched roofs were cheap but highly flammable. A single spark could ignite a roof, and fire would spread rapidly from building to building in the tightly packed quarters. Wealthier houses used wooden shingles or, for the very wealthy, slate tiles. Windows were small openings covered with wooden shutters. Glass was expensive and rare. Only churches and the wealthiest homes had glass windows. Most people closed wooden shutters at night and in bad weather, making interiors dark and stuffy. The major exception to timber construction was the stone buildings. Notre-Dame Cathedral, begun in 1163, was still under construction in 1200. The nave was complete, but work continued on the western facade and towers. This Gothic cathedral, with its pointed arches, flying buttresses, and soaring vaults, represented the cutting edge of architectural technology. The royal palace on the western end of the de la Cité was a complex of stone buildings, including the Sainte-Chapelle, though the current Sainte-Chapelle wasn't built until the 1240s. The palace served as both the king's residence and the administrative center of the kingdom. Philip Augustus had also begun construction of the Louvre, not the grand palace we know today, but a fortress. In 1200, it was a massive stone tower surrounded by defensive walls, located on the right bank outside the city walls, guarding the western approach to Paris. Churches dotted the city. Beyond Notre-Dame, there were dozens of smaller parish churches serving different neighborhoods: Saint-Germain-des-Prés on the left bank, Saint-Gervais on the right bank, and many others. These were stone structures, often built on the foundations of earlier churches, with Romanesque or early Gothic architecture. Population and social hierarchy. Paris in 1200 had a population estimated at 50,000 to perhaps 80,000 at most, making it one of the largest cities in Europe. Only Constantinople, see Rhoda, and a few Italian cities clearly exceeded it in size. The population was rigidly stratified by birth, occupation, and legal status. At the apex stood the king and the royal court. Philip II Augustus and his household resided in the royal palace on the de la Cité. The court included nobles, royal officials, advisors, chaplains, and servants. The nobility, barons, knights, and their families controlled land and military power. Many maintained residences in Paris, though their primary estates were in the countryside. They lived in the best stone houses, wore fine clothing, ate rich foods, and monopolized political power. The clergy formed a parallel hierarchy. The Bishop of Paris, residing near Notre-Dame, was one of the most powerful figures in the city. Below him were canons, senior clergy attached to the cathedral, parish priests, monks, and friars. The church owned vast properties in and around Paris. The emerging bourgeoisie, wealthy merchants, and master craftsmen formed an increasingly important class. These men controlled trade, owned shops and workshops, and were accumulating wealth that sometimes rivaled the lesser nobility. They lived in substantial timber houses, wore good clothing though legally restricted from imitating nobles, and were beginning to organize into guilds. Master craftsmen and merchants who owned their businesses formed the upper tier of common people. They employed journeymen, skilled workers who worked for wages, and apprentices, young people learning trades. Below them were laborers, servants, and the working poor, people who owned nothing, worked for wages or subsistence, and lived on the edge of survival. Beggars, prostitutes, and criminals occupied the bottom of society. They lived in the worst housing, had no legal protections, and survived through charity, crime, or prostitution. Streets, housing, and sanitation. Daily life in Paris in 1200 was shaped by the physical conditions of the city, which were harsh by modern standards. Streets were narrow, often only 3 to 4 meters wide. They were unpaved. In dry weather, they were dusty. In wet weather, they became rivers of mud. The pavement was simply hard-packed earth, stones, and whatever debris had been trampled into the surface. There was no organized waste removal. Human and animal waste was thrown into the streets or into the Seine. A law from 1185 required that waste not be thrown from windows without first shouting a warning, gare l'eau, watch out for water, which evolved into the English word garde l'eau. Refuse piles accumulated in streets and against buildings. Pigs were everywhere, roaming freely through the streets, feeding on garbage. They served as the city's primary waste disposal system. In 1131, the heir to the throne had been killed when his horse tripped over a pig in the street, leading to attempts to ban pigs from certain areas, but enforcement was minimal. Open sewers, ditches running down the centers of streets carried rainwater, waste, and refuse toward the Seine. The smell was overwhelming, especially in summer. Most people lived in cramped conditions. A typical artisan family might occupy a single room or two in a timber house. The ground floor often served as a workshop, opening directly onto the street. Living quarters were above. Families slept together in a single room, often sharing beds. Privacy, as we understand it, did not exist. Furniture was minimal: wooden benches or stools, a table, a chest for storing clothing and valuables, and a bed for those who could afford one. Many slept on straw pallets on the floor. Cooking was done over a hearth, with smoke escaping through gaps in the roof or a hole in the ceiling. As proper chimneys were rare in ordinary houses, water came from wells or the Seine. The water was often contaminated. Wine and ale were safer to drink and were consumed by everyone, including children, usually watered down. Food and daily sustenance. Food in Paris in 1200 varied dramatically by social class, but was generally simple and monotonous for most people. For common people, bread was the foundation of the diet. Bread was made from whatever grain was available and affordable: wheat for the wealthy, rye or barley for the poor. Bakers operated throughout the city, and buying bread from a bakery was common since many homes lacked ovens. Pottage, a thick soup or porridge made from grain, vegetables, and sometimes small amounts of meat or fish, was a staple. Vegetables included cabbage, onions, leeks, peas, beans, and turnips. These were boiled, often for hours, into a thick stew. Meat was expensive and reserved for special occasions for most people. When available, it was often pork, chicken, or fish. The Seine provided fish, and Friday was a meatless day for Christians, so fish markets were important. Cheese and eggs supplemented the diet. Dairy products were common, though milk often spoiled quickly and was more commonly made into cheese. Herbs and spices were used for flavoring, though expensive. Imported spices like pepper, cinnamon, and cloves were luxuries available only to the wealthy. The wealthy ate vastly better. They consumed roasted meats, game birds, fine white bread, imported wines, and dishes prepared with expensive spices. Noble feasts could feature multiple courses, elaborate preparations, and displays of wealth through food. Markets operated in designated areas. Les Halles, on the right bank, was emerging as the central market. Here, farmers from surrounding countryside brought produce, livestock, and goods to sell. Butchers, fishmongers, and bakers had stalls. The market was crowded, noisy, and smelled of animals, fish, and unwashed humanity. Food preservation was critical. Salting, smoking, drying, and pickling preserved meat and fish. Root vegetables could be stored in cellars, but fresh food spoiled quickly, so most food was consumed within days of purchase. Ale and wine were the standard beverages. Water was unsafe, so even children drank weak ale or watered wine. Taverns and alehouses were common and served as social gathering places. Trade and economy. Paris in 1200 was a growing commercial center, though its economy was still primarily local rather than international. Craft guilds were organizing to regulate trades. These associations of masters, in particular crafts, bakers, weavers, shoemakers, metalworkers, and others, set standards, controlled who could practice the trade, and regulated prices. Guild membership was jealously guarded and often hereditary. The River Seine was critical for trade. Boats brought timber, wine, grain, salt, and other goods to Paris from upstream and downstream. The port on the right bank, near the Place de Gervais, was the center of river commerce. The money changers and early bankers operated from the Grand Pont. They exchanged currencies, provided loans, and facilitated commerce. These men were often Jewish, as Christian prohibitions against usury charging interest on loans were stricter. Craftsmen worked in small workshops. A master might employ 1 or 2 journeymen and an apprentice. Apprentices were boys, rarely girls, who learned trades over several years, working for room and board. After completing apprenticeship, they became journeymen, working for wages. Only after years of work and demonstration of skill could a journeyman become a master and open his own shop. Cloth production was important. Weavers, fullers, and dyers worked wool and linen into cloth. This was labor-intensive work, much of it done by women. The University of Paris was emerging as an economic force. Students and masters from across Europe came to study theology, law, and the liberal arts. They rented rooms, bought books and supplies, and supported taverns and food vendors. The university quarter on the left bank was growing rapidly, Coinage circulated silver deniers minted by the king and various lords, but barter was still common for everyday transactions among common people, religion, and the church. The Catholic Church dominated every aspect of life in Paris in 1200. Religion was not optional, it was the organizing principle of society, law, and daily existence. The liturgical calendar structured time. Sundays and numerous feast days required attendance at Mass. The church bells marked the hours matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, compline calling the faithful to prayer throughout the day. Notre-Dame Cathedral was the spiritual center of Paris. Mass was celebrated in Latin, which most people did not understand. The ritual was elaborate, with incense, chanting, and processions. Lay people attended but did not participate directly in the service as modern Catholics do. Relics, bones, or belongings of saints were venerated. Churches claimed to possess pieces of the true cross, bones of apostles, or other holy objects. These relics attracted pilgrims and demonstrated the spiritual power and prestige of the institution that held them. The sacrament structured life. Baptism shortly after birth, confirmation in adolescence, marriage, confession, communion, last rites before death. These rituals were obligatory and administered only by the church. Parish churches served neighborhoods. Each parish had a priest who conducted services, administered sacraments, and theoretically provided spiritual guidance. In practice, many parish priests were poorly educated and barely literate. Monasteries and convents operated in and around Paris. Monks and nuns followed strict rules of prayer, work, and obedience. They preserved literacy, copied manuscripts, provided charity, and maintained schools. The church owned vast amounts of property. It collected tithes 10% of agricultural production from the faithful. Bishops and abbots were major landowners and wielded political power alongside spiritual authority. Heresy was a serious crime. Those who deviated from church teaching could be excommunicated, which meant social death, or worse, tried and executed. The Albigensian crusade against heretics in southern France was ongoing in this period. Though Paris was not directly affected, dangers, crime, disease, and fire. Life in Paris in 1200 was dangerous in ways modern urban dwellers can barely imagine. Crime was endemic. Streets were dark at night, there were no street lamps. Going out after dark was risky. Bandits, thieves, and violent criminals operated openly in some quarters. The city watch was minimal and ineffective. Murder, assault, robbery, and rape were common. Justice was harsh but inconsistently applied. Criminals could be hanged, mutilated, cutting off hands or ears, or branded. Public executions served as both punishment and entertainment. The right of sanctuary allowed criminals who reached a church to claim protection from secular authorities. This created zones where fugitives clustered, sometimes protected by the church against royal justice. Disease was a constant threat. Paris had no sewage system, contaminated water, and dense crowded housing, ideal conditions for epidemics. Dysentery, typhoid, tuberculosis, and other diseases killed regularly. The Black Death would not arrive until 1348, but smaller epidemics struck periodically. Medical knowledge was primitive. Illness was often attributed to bad air, miasma, sin, or demonic influence. Treatment involved bloodletting, purging, and herbal remedies of dubious efficacy. Many people died from infections that antibiotics would easily cure today. Fire was perhaps the greatest danger. With timber buildings, thatched roofs, open hearths, candles, and no organized firefighting, fires could destroy entire neighborhoods. A fire in 1200 could spread from house to house, unstoppable until it burned out or reached a stone building or open space that served as a firebreak. Flooding was another hazard. The Seine flooded periodically, inundating low-lying areas, destroying buildings, and contaminating wells. Infant mortality was extreme. Perhaps 30 to 50% of children died before age 5. Women faced significant risks in childbirth. Life expectancy at birth was around 30 to 35 years. Though those who survived childhood might live to 50 or 60, defense and warfare. Paris in 1200 was a fortified city, and defense was a constant concern. The walls built by Philip Augustus on the right bank enclosed the city with a stone circuit approximately 6 meters high and 2 meters thick. Towers punctuated the walls at regular intervals. Gates controlled entry and exit. Guards manned the gates, collecting tolls on goods entering the city and watching for threats. The Louvre fortress, begun in 1190, guarded the western approach. This massive cylindrical tower, the Tour du Louvre, was surrounded by defensive walls and a moat. It served as both fortress and treasury. The city was not constantly at war, but the threat was real. The 100 Years' War was still in the future, but conflicts between the French king and various nobles, or with the English, created periodic dangers. The city militia, able-bodied men required to serve when called, could be mobilized for defense. These were not professional soldiers but craftsmen, merchants, and laborers temporarily armed with spears, bows, and whatever weapons they possessed. The nobility provided the military backbone. Knights and their retinues, armed with swords, lances, and protected by armor, formed the elite fighting force. Military service was a feudal obligation. Nobles owed military service to the king in exchange for land grants. Paris was more often threatened by internal disorder than external enemies. Riots, factional conflicts, and urban violence required military intervention. The line between criminal gang and armed faction was often blurry. Conclusion: from medieval mud to modern glory. The Paris of 1200, cramped, filthy, dangerous, dominated by the church and the monarchy, bears almost no resemblance to the city of light we know today. Standing on the La de la Cité in 1200, you would be surrounded by timber houses, narrow muddy streets, the smell of sewage and rotting garbage, the constant ringing of church bells, pigs rooting in refuse piles, and the ever-present threat of fire, disease, or violence. Notre-Dame was rising but incomplete. The Louvre was a fortress, not a museum. There were no grand boulevards, no Eiffel Tower, no Arc de Triomphe, no Luxembourg Gardens. The city was a fraction of its current size, contained within walls, with countryside visible from any high point. But this medieval city was also dynamic. The University of Paris was emerging as Europe's intellectual center. Trade was expanding. Guilds were organizing. The population was growing. The foundations were being laid for Paris's future greatness. The transformation from the Paris of 1200 to modern Paris took centuries. The Renaissance brought new ideas and architectural styles. The absolute monarchy of Louis XIV made Paris a capital of European power and culture. The French Revolution demolished much of the medieval city. The 19th century renovations of Baron Haussmann created the Paris of wide boulevards and grand buildings we recognize today. But in 1200, none of that was visible. Paris was simply a medieval city, dirty, dangerous, and deeply religious, where 50,000 people struggled with mud, disease, and the constant challenges of daily survival in a pre-modern urban environment. Understanding how people actually lived in medieval Paris, the mud, the smell, the danger, the rigid social hierarchies, the dominance of religion, gives us perspective on how far we've come and how recently. The Paris of 1200 is only 27 or 28 generations removed from us. Yet it was a world so different, so harsh, and so alien that it might as well be another planet.